Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the in-person audience and the Zoom audience. So this is the second event of Jews and Performance. And the last event, we had an event last week on a very entertaining event on how the old repertoire has been revisited in the past and is revisited now. So Yiddish old repertoire in theater and song. And we will talk today about a slightly more controversial topic, the question of casting non-Jewish actors for Jewish roles. So this has recently made headlines with debates being sparked around film, television, and theater in the USA, in the UK, and beyond, with some giving it the name JewFace. So we will try today with our speakers to examine this question in a nuanced way. So we have three speakers, including Uri Agnon, who is the organizer of this event and of this series of events, and who is a Parks Outreach Fellow and PhD students. So before I introduce our speakers, just a few technical advice. So this event is hybrid. It will be recorded. So if you are on Zoom and if you don't want to appear on the recording, please keep your camera off. You will be able to participate in the discussion at the end, so you can post your questions in the chat or raise your hand. And on Zoom, you can also turn on and off the transcript if you need. Okay, so we'll have three short presentations by each speaker and then a conversation. So I will introduce our first speaker, who is Sue Weiss. I'm very pleased and honored to have Sue Weiss. She's professor of English literature at the University of Sheffield, where she teaches contemporary literature, film, and Holocaust studies. Her most recent publications include Textual Deceptions, Literary Hoaxes, and False Memoirs in the Contemporary Area, the co-edited volume representing perpetrators in Holocaust literature and film with Jenny Adams and Barry Haynes, Case Threads and Beyond with David Forrest. And her latest book is about Claude Lanzmann's Shoah. So Claude Lanzmann's Shoah Outtakes, Holocaust Rescue and Resistance. So I will, you can come to the lectern.
Thank you, Claire.
And I will
I'm going to assist me, I think.
Share
kindly
your presentation.
Sound as well.
Do you have sound in your presentation?
No, I don't. I'm not showing any clips, I'm afraid, but it's all available on iPlayer.
So why can't I?
It was there for a second, wasn't it?
Can you see something on the screen, Anushka?
No.
Okay.
If you could share.
Yeah, just share. It's in a new version that we have.
Oh, you think it shares? Does it share?
It has, yeah. Just go around the screen.
There you go.
Thank you. So I could just press the thing.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you for your assistance with that. We've had also briefly, before this all began, we were just having a discussion about these questions of casting. I wanted to change my talk as a result, but it made me feel empowered to say what I think about it. So that's good. Anyway, I expect many of you have seen or definitely heard about the TV series Ridley Road, broadcast on the BBC in October 2021, exactly a year ago, practically, and set in 1962. It's based on Joe Bloom's novel of 2014 with a screenplay by Sarah Sigal. Its title referring to the street market in Hackney's Ridley Road, which is still in existence. If you want to visit, it's opposite Dalston Kingsland Overground Station, an area which used to be a hub of Jewish life. Each of the 4 episodes starts with intertitles stating that the series was inspired by real events, and then warning the viewer that it includes discriminatory language and content. And both these factors highlight what is so intriguing about this drama. To remind you, Ridley Road focuses on a young Jewish woman, Vivian Epstein, who arrives in early 1960s London from Manchester. While searching for her boyfriend, Jack Morris, she, like him, becomes an infiltrator in Colin Jordan's British National Socialist Movement, or NSM, on behalf of the Jewish defence organisation, the 62 Group. As a pithy summary puts it, Jewish hairdresser spies on neo-Nazis. The story is a mixture of fact and fiction. It brings out into public memory the bleaker aspects of London in the swinging 60s, such as the resurgence of homegrown fascism in Britain just 17 years after the war's end, in a form under Jordan, even more faithful to Hitler than Oswald Mosley's. The series dramatises actual atrocities against Jewish communities, including desecrating graves, attacking synagogues, and even the death of a yeshiva student, in this era before the Race Relations Act of 1965 or any hate speech legislation. It recreates a notorious NSM rally in Trafalgar Square. You can see a little bit of it in the Ridley Road picture there, with faithful attention to the placards, which are blotted out because that's the book cover. So it doesn't want to show you the fact that it says "Free Britain from Jewish Control," but that's what they say. And even Colin Jordan's outfit, you can see a bit of there. Against this dismaying backdrop, Ridley Road shows the slightly more heartening policy of the 62 Group to fight back against the fascists on the streets, led in the series by the taxi driver Solly Malinowski, played by Eddie Marsan, and based on a real figure. The series therefore raises important matters such as the so-called defence debate, whether to use violence to counter violence, and shows alliances between Jews and people of colour in the face of discrimination. In addition, the material is knowingly brought up to date in the context of such phenomena as Black Lives Matter through changes to the original novel. The drama's dialogue makes connections between the past and the present, using familiar slogans about freedom of speech, which the Nazis voice, in order that they're able to voice slurs about Zionist conspiracies and Jewish world dominance. Joe Bloom, the author of the original novel, says, "I frequently distanced myself from the truth to serve the story, and the TV series goes even further in its inventions." The fictional Vivian is a much more active character on screen. She not only manages to infiltrate the NSM by presenting herself as a fan of Colin Jordan, including marching alongside him, as you see on what I think is your left, when she's wearing the blue dress anyway, marching alongside him at rallies. She also uncomfortably takes part in what we might call consensual but unwanted sexual barter in the form of a completely imagined romance with Jordan, and becomes genuinely fond of his son, Paul. And this is the premise for the series' deliberately disorienting opening scene, which you can see in the other slide. In a stately home in Kent, we see a young blonde woman, before we even be introduced to Vivian, who's playing with a little boy in a sunlit bedroom, joined by an ordinary looking man, whom the boy calls Daddy. We discover this is Colin Jordan. They all give a Nazi salute and declare, "Wir werden wiederkommen," we will come back. Nazism is, it seems, at the heart of British life. Beyond all this, Ridley Road also became celebrated in relation to the casting of its actors, in relation to the theme of this discussion. The drama has what the scriptwriter Sarah Soleimani calls an ensemble cast, a mixture of Jewish and non-Jewish people, as she puts it, with some of the non-Jewish actors playing Jewish characters, notably the two main roles, Agnes O'Casey as Vivian and Tom Berry as her boyfriend, Jack. There's a picture of the ensemble cast in a minute. Anyway, we'll get on to that. This led to a return of the debate, if it's ever gone away in recent years, about what has been called JewFace, as Claire mentioned. This term, which is rather ugly to say, I feel, has a long history, used in the 19th century to criticise the exaggerated performance of a Jewish role in accent and physical appearance, interestingly, regardless of the actor's own identity. More recently, it's been used about the relationship between actor and role. The American comedian Sarah Silverman criticized the casting of the non-Jewish Catherine Hahn to play Joan Rivers. I think you can see why they cast her in that role. In the UK, Maureen Lipman made a similar criticism of Helen Mirren, taking the role of Golda Meir, claiming, "I'm sure she will be marvelous, but it would never be allowed for Ben Kingsley to play Nelson Mandela. You just couldn't go there." Lipman seems to imply an additional criticism, since, as we know, Ben Kingsley, and Lipman seems to be referring to his Gujarati Indian heritage, won an Oscar for his role as the Jewish Isaac Stern in Schindler's List. As well as these uncomfortable essentializings of ethnicity, yet reflections on audience expectation perhaps, we can see that this contemporary usage of the term JewFace has a new emphasis. First, it refers to a perceived inequality in casting decisions, so that non-Jews are more likely perhaps to play Jews than is the reverse, with some Jewish actors claiming that they have been judged unsuitable for generic roles. And second, it highlights an alleged discrepancy between the way breaches of authentic casting are treated where Jews are concerned versus other minorities. And when we were discussing this just before, this is what David Baddiel calls in his book of that name, Jews Don't Count. It's considered not to matter, in other words, where Jews are concerned. Giving a response to Silverman's question, Baddiel argues, just moving on, that the assumption it's okay for non-Jews to take Jewish roles is, he says, about Jews being assumed anti-Semitically to be successful and privileged and powerful, and therefore not in need of the protections that identity politics afford other minorities. Obviously something for discussion, perhaps. We might add that they are also assumed to be white. It's part of a wider cultural debate, in other words. Baddiel goes on to offer a new phrase in place of JewFace, since he says it's not just about facial expressions or features, but a whole way of presenting oneself, consisting of what he calls tics and shrugs and stooping and whining and fetching, which he has called nebbish being. I feel the phrase is better perhaps than what it's used to describe. But anyway, as we might expect, others have argued against the very existence of JewFace as a reprehensible practice. The playwright Ryan Craig calls the notion a cultural disaster if it means that only Jewish actors can be cast as Jewish characters. The actor Elliot Levy adds, the notion of people showing their papers to authenticate Jewish ancestry in order to justify playing a Jewish role is a dystopian nightmare. That seems a very good summary of the counter-argument. However, there's a great deal of anecdotal evidence here on both sides in phrasing that might make us feel uncomfortable. The paradoxes implicit in many of these statements are clear if we return to the case of the TV drama Ridley Road. To quote Baddiel again, he says, most of the lead actors here playing Jews in a story about anti-Semitism aren't Jewish. I'm fine with that, but it wouldn't be fine for the BBC to cast like this with any other minority. That in itself is quite a contradictory position. Baddiel's words imply that viewing all minorities identically is the principle at stake, not just that of authentic casting. There are other aspects of the casting of Ridley Road which might be overcome by thinking about it in that particular way. As well as an ensemble in Soleimani's sense, and you can see the three main characters there. The cast is a mixture of well-known actors, including Rita Tushingham, who appeared in the 1960s and is kind of self-consciously cast, Rory Kinnear as Jordan, Samantha Spiro and Tracy Ann Oberman, who are very well known from Jewish television comedy, alongside first-timers. If we were going to look into that matter, it seems that the Jewish identified actors are in supporting roles as character actors, and it made me start to think, because of the death in the past couple of weeks of Harry Landis, who was often cast as a Jewish character actor, what does that term actually mean? In any case, in particular, the main character, Vivian Epstein, is played by the newcomer Agnes O'Casey, whose connection to the Irish playwright Sean O'Casey, her great-grandfather, with whom she shares a last name, was widely mentioned in publicity. Yet O'Casey, the name, turns out to be a stage name, the actor's original name of Agnes Koenig, indebted to her Jewish grandfather, the American-born actor Lawrence Koenig, who himself had roles in 1960s British television drama. As we might expect, given the backdrop to the debate, it's her grandfather's Jewish identity rather than his renown as an actor, which was foregrounded in press coverage of Agnes O'Casey's role as Vivian. Some critics even found the retrieval of this kosher forebear to follow suspiciously quickly on Baddiel's criticisms, and was presumably not the reason for her being given the role. Meanwhile, the non-Jewish Eddie Marsan described being the target of anti-Semitic abuse on Twitter simply for playing the role of the taxi driver Solly Malinowski, suggesting that you really don't have to be Jewish. To return to Agnes O'Casey, she perhaps felt impelled to state in an interview that the scriptwriter Soleimani was very helpful and, as she says, put me in touch with her rabbi. This presumably refers to O'Casey getting her performance right rather than her own wish for religious guidance. In those moments in the drama where Vivian utters a Hebrew prayer and recites the traditional priestly blessing over Colin Jordan's son, Paul, may the Lord bless you and keep you. A very moving moment, surprisingly. For her part, Soleimani also seems impelled to enter implicitly into the debate by claiming Agnes O'Casey is a patrilineal Jew. Her Jewish line goes through her grandfather and her father. For me, that was enough, and her relationship with her faith as being sort of inside and outside is something I relate to as a patrilineal Jew who ended up doing a formal conversion. Soleimani adds, casting is a huge issue, but she goes on to say it was actually more about class than about faith. For me, bringing working class actors onto the screen and giving them opportunities, that probably led to my casting decisions more than any racial, religious, or ethnic heritage. Is there a valuable acknowledgement of intersectional identities here, perhaps, or a sidestepping of the issue? What does Soleimani mean, and does it matter, by O'Casey's own faith? I recently saw, which some others of you also might have seen, Jonathan Friedland's play Jews in Their Own Words, which is a whole other matter, in which each member of the all-Jewish cast, they step outside the drama to specify that at the end, each member of the cast plays several characters. I found the enactment by one of the actors, Steve First, of the accents of a working class decorator from Stoke Newington and Howard Jacobson's Mancunian accent to be quite jarring at first. That seemed like an impersonation, to echo Baddiel's phrasing, even though not because it was of a Jewish person. It's hard to know what to make of all this. Are we talking about fiction or reality, aesthetics or politics? It seems both. The debate over casting does maybe inadvertently restate important issues in Jewish culture, including patrilineal descent, ethnicity versus Jewish literacy and self-identification, as well as that of intersectional identity and the importance of acknowledging Black, non-Ashkenazi and elective Jews. Given that Ridley Road's plot is about acting, pretense and infiltration, it's tempting to say that the drama exhibits a self-conscious awareness of all of these questions. Even in formal terms, the drama blends reality with invention by splicing together its own recreation of 1960s London with actual archival footage from the era. And the one showing the two women is documentary footage. The other one of Vivian herself is from the contemporary era. And this splicing together of the real and the non-real is done very convincingly. In the image from the documentary past of the two women, it's as if we're seeing these 1960s women from Vivian's viewpoint, so you can't always tell what you're watching. We see genuine colour footage of Soho landmarks, market stalls, shop windows, Troy's restaurant, Dean Street bars, black passers-by, lots of red double-decker buses, as well as fascist newspaper sellers and rallies. Sometimes the two realms of documentary and fiction are united, again in a self-conscious way. For instance, when we see Vivian holding what looks like a real-life leaflet advertising Trellick Tower, the brutalist council block where her landlady, Mrs. Jones, is unwillingly relocated from her slum terrace, and gives a prompt for her to be a sympathiser of the fascists initially. Not only is this an ironic glance at the current inequality in the housing market, now that Trellick Tower is a sought-after address, it also reinforces the illusion that we're seeing locations in 1960s London, but these supposedly London scenes were instead filmed in Bolton and Manchester, notably Tib Street, described by a local as one of the last untainted streets in the Northern Quarter. This suggests that visual signifiers where location is concerned are not literal. In addition to this non-realist geography, Ridley Road's own plot centres on imitation and pretense. Vivian masquerades, and you can see her doing so there, as non-Jewish in different ways. At the drama's opening, it's a feature of everyday life. Vivian is advised by her German refugee cousin Rosa not to use the name Epstein in London, but to call herself Evans. And we see her hide her Star of David necklace on the train down from Manchester. This imagery of self-conscious pretense becomes more complex as Vivian tries to convince Colin Jordan that she too is a committed fascist from a church-going family. We're still looking at her there, blonde. As part of this role, Vivian, fortunately a hairdresser, dyes her hair blonde for reasons which are not straightforward, perhaps to stop people recognizing her, or as a sign of class or glamour identity, suggesting sexual availability, or for the sake of an Aryan look, in inverted commas. She's praised for looking like a movie star or like Marilyn Monroe, bringing attention to the artificiality of the blondness. The idea of Jews infiltrating a far-right group itself means it's an advantage if, as Vivian's boyfriend Jack says, I can pass, can't I? This statement invokes, in a negative way, the fantasy of Jewish bodily difference, or the existence of what Keith Kahn Harris calls the generic Jew. It might seem also to allude knowingly to the casting controversy. However, giving these lines to a non-Jewish actor is itself perhaps contradictory. In conclusion, my interest in Ridley Road related initially to the crucial gap between the publication of Joe Bloom's novel in 2014 and the television adaptation in 2021. Between these dates occurred, as we all know, the Leave outcome of the UK's 2016 referendum on EU membership. I felt that adapting this story about British fascism must have an ironic contemporary significance post-2016, which was missing from the original. Ridley Road is not the only work to return to an earlier text about British Nazism as a way to reflect on departure from the EU, though interestingly, the Jewish aspect is often not present. This is also the case for the updated versions of counterfactual histories of the Second World War, which depict British wartime surrender. Visiting these texts and the idea of Nazi rule in Britain after 2016 conveys unease about what might be to come. As in, for example, C.J. Carey's novel from 2021, Widowland, which is a revision, as the title suggests, of Robert Harris's Fatherland from 1992. In her novel, the action has shifted from victorious Germany to occupied Britain. In addition, a review of the 2017 television series, which you can see there, SSGB, about Nazi-occupied Britain, based on Len Deighton's 1978 novel of the same name, was titled Isolated Britain Falling Under Fascist Rule. Imagine that. In the case of Ridley Road, the gap of the crucial 7 years between Bloom's novel and the television series comes across clearly. By contrast to the novel, which focuses on the past in offering historical detail about the British far right and anti-fascist activity, The television drama gives contemporary relevance to these concerns, shown by such statements as Vivian's in her role as pretending to be a fascist, saying, "We must take our country back." The drama gives a sense of the estrangement felt by ordinary people under globalization, a word which we've heard again in the past couple of weeks, as well as the reactionary and anti-Semitic aspects of such a reaction. In Ridley Road, a local fascist leader laments the loss of local shops, as do we all, but then tells the meeting that the culprit is a supermarket called Tesco, owned by Jack Cohen. In this way, the series shows that extremism emerges from everyday life with lessons for the present. There's a telling final dialogue between Nancy Malinowski and Stevie, the character who's been changed from the Jewish Stevie Perlman in the novel to a Black British student in the television series, and who's shown regularly being subject to police harassment. Nancy says to Stevie of their shared antipathy to Colin Jordan, "We're all the same in the end," to which he replies, "Not quite the same, but fighting the same fight." Perhaps this is the drama's final verdict on questions of casting and identity. Although such decisions in film and television do expose how people see Jews and play up to that, they suggest that varied responses to different minorities are not necessarily detrimental, but airing these questions is crucial. To quote the final intertitle of Ridley Road, "The fight against fascism continues." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue, for a very stimulating paper. And I will now introduce our next speaker, who is Uri Agnon, who is a composer, activist, and PhD researcher here at the University of Southampton. His practice-led research looks at the cross relations of activism and composition. Uri's music explores the political topics and theatrical modes, and his pieces include an opera, Word Problems, the oratorio Custodian, and most recently the musical Antisemitism, which was researched and developed this year with the support of the Arts Institute and JW3 and the Arts Council England. And I think we will listen to some extracts. So please, the floor is yours. Do you need help? No, it's not yours. This one.
Where is the Zoom? Share?
Yeah, this one, the green one.
Green one, yeah, of course.
No, this one.
Share this down. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Sue, for all of that. That was very interesting and would be, I think, I hope some things will resonate. So I want to speak about this question of casting Jewishness through a case study, which is my own work, the musical Antisemitism, which I've been working on for the last 3 years, and which over this last year had a R&D, so research and development, as Claire said, supported by Parks, Arts Council, and JW3. And during that research and development, we put on 2 performances of the show and did some recordings, and lots of questions that have to do with casting came up around that, and I want to explore them in this talk. So first of all, the musical itself follows, it's called Antisemitism, so you can imagine what it's about. And it tells the story of an Israeli moving from Israel to the UK, following his first 24 hours here. Sort of coming thinking, oh, anti-Semitism is this thing I learned in high school about. It's not relevant in any ways to my life, because when you're Jewish in Israel, then you're like money, it's like, that's the identity of power, right? And then moving here and being a minority. So he thinks, oh, I'll be a bit exotic. I'll be white, but not quite. That sounds like a fun thing to be in a way. And he arrives to the UK and meets all sorts of characters and shifts, this opinion shifts, or we look at it from different angles. And the story is narrated by 2 narrators who also they portray all the roles of everyone that he meets, from his Jewish aunts to a pair of boomer kidnappers who kidnap him, believing they have Uri Geller. So all of these roles are played by these two characters. And before we get to actually what were the questions, I thought I'll do a little experiment with everyone, and I'll play a song from the musical, one of the songs that protagonist sings, and ask you to listen to it and try and think how would your listening would be changed if you thought that the singer was Jewish or if you thought the singer was not Jewish. Would it change anything in your experience of this song? Would it not? And hopefully we can discuss that in a bit. Maybe, there it is. Not this one. I need to reopen it. Bear with me.
Now it's time for someone else to feel guilty. Now it's time for someone else to feel guilty. Now it's time for someone else to feel guilty. A Palestinian waiter once told me I'm rude. For 3 days at least, I didn't touch food. She didn't actually say it, it was clear from her face. When oh did I hope to disappear without trace. And once I gave directions without being sure, I couldn't sleep a wink until Yom Kippur. But now I know nothing, no knowledge, no fear. And the biggest relief, my mother's not here. Now it's time for someone else to feel guilty. Now it's time for someone else to feel guilty. Now it's time for someone else to feel guilty. As I bask in the light of my own marginality. Ema, I'm sorry about the first verse. You'd say the same if things were reversed. Tonight I feel lighter than ever before, shedding the weight of 100 years war. I just can't wait to see what the UK has in store. Some of the chatter filling the space doesn't really flatter me as a race. Sure, I don't love it, I'm not head over kilt, but if I must choose, I'll take threats over guilt. Now it's time for someone else to feel guilty. Now it's time for someone else to feel guilty. Now it's time for someone else to feel guilty. As I bask in the light of my own marginality. You can hate me, slate me, just don't shame me, trash me, bash me, just don't blame me. I look at the statues, I look at street names. I don't know who they were or from where they came. I'm sure there's some filth underneath what I see, but no King George V is related to me. I see all this splendor, I see all the loot. It's someone else's karma, I don't give a hoot. You can call me a kike, you can call me a yid. Just don't say, look at what your forefathers did. Unless you mean murder Jesus, in which case, blame me, shame me, with your falsehoods. Come on, fight me, bite me. Does it taste good? Do you feel it creep inside? Does it freeze inside your veins? Makes you feel that you can't hide from those eyes within your brain. And you know you can't relate it, cause it worsens when you say it. Your emotions are time for someone else to feel guilty. Guess it's time for someone else to feel guilty. Yes, it's time for someone else to feel guilty. Now it's time for someone else to feel guilty. Now it's time for all you rest to feel guilty. As I bask in the light of my own marginality.
Okay.
It's hard to be hopeful
Up.
when the
You don't want another
statue's on
song?
fire. It's hard to be hopeful when you're not getting hired. Hard to be hopeful when
Are
you're
you
so
singing?
goddamn tired. Hard when the popes all kill all the Jews. It's hard when you read the news. It's hard to feel hopeful with people forgetting what causes regret.
Sorry. Yes. So, I think this example, not there yet, raises, oh, why not? raises a few things that come out from this show generally about what does it mean to have someone non-Jewish play a Jewish role in this show. And that singer was Guy Wolf, who is Jewish. I think the thing that pops onto mind most maybe is the slurs. So he uses two very bad words for Jews, and having someone non-Jewish sing that or someone Jewish sing that could feel different for the actor and for the audience. That's one thing. And also there's this nebuching, I would say, as well, with this Jewish anxiety and jokes about mothers and all sorts of things that have to do with where ideas of Jewishness. So this might be, if someone non-Jewish plays this role, would it be stereotyping? Would it be trying to create a stereotype of a Jew and fill that, wear that as costume? And is that the same thing if a Jew plays it? Will they also be putting on this stereotype or not? So these are all questions that I think come up in any piece, but especially in this piece, because it's about anti-Semitism. It has a lot of provocative language, lots of provocative themes, lots of Holocaust jokes, for example. So a Holocaust joke, I think, feels very different. If someone Jewish says it, you hear that a lot. Or if someone non-Jewish said that, I don't want to hear that at all. So there are different things within that the show brings. So this humor and politics and Jewishness and anti-Semitism. That's one reason why maybe we should only take Jews to play it. On the other hand, while the theme lends itself to that reading, the style might take us a different way, because the show is a Brechtian show. So the actors are not meant to inhabit the souls of the players, the characters that they're portraying. We're not supposed to believe that they're actually going through all of these things. They keep changing, and the illusion of the theater is supposed to be broken all the time through breaking the fourth wall, through the same actors playing different roles. And the idea here is that the mechanism of the theater is used for us, is made clear so that we can engage with it critically. And so maybe actually there's something to be gained by hearing the same text, the same ideas by someone Jewish and someone non-Jewish, and feeling how that feels different. Maybe there's something interesting in the style. And maybe just if it's a Brechtian show, it doesn't matter, because we know they're not supposed to be playing those roles. So those are sort of the general questions that we came in with. And by we, I mean myself and Emma Jude Harris, who was the director for the R&D. We worked on over the last year on this show and continue to work. And we were doing the casting and thinking about these questions. And finally, we had a really excellent cast that included two Jewish actors, one playing the protagonist and one playing one of the narrators. So David Jamal playing the protagonist, and Michal Ish Horowitz playing the narrator one, and a non-Jewish actor, Molly Lynch, playing narrator two. And that was a very interesting experience, and I'll talk a bit about what were the challenges around that and what that allowed. So I want to talk around this character, Leah, one of the Jewish protagonist's aunts, who he meets in London. And let's let her speak for herself. We'll see a very short, very short part of it. There we go. Just about a minute, but it will give us a sense of the scene with them. Just to say, filming theater is never great, and especially not in an R&D. So excuse the film, but let's look at the.
Wondering where a wanderer might wind up for the night, the door opens.
Why is it not at all in the same time?
And two.
This was working before. No, it's just out of sync.
Just has air and is about to lose faith, wondering where a wanderer might wind up for the night, the door opens, and two
Stunning.
ladies appear.
Look, Rachel! Our baby nephew!
I can see that, Leah.
He's come all the way to London.
Yes, that's apparent.
Hasn't he grown marvellously?
It's the first time we've seen him, Leah.
No, he didn't come out of his mama schmundy looking like that.
Watch the language,
He
Leah.
doesn't know what it means.
He's Israeli, not stupid.
Potato, potato.
Hi.
Hello, dear. Was the flight all right?
Did you find the place simple enough?
Did you take the Northern
Did
Line?
anyone bother you on the tube?
Like you'd even know if they did.
Israelis. Not that you're much better at spotting the Jew baiters.
Me? What, you'd give a man my head if he'd say law and order loud enough.
Does this thing ever stop?
At least I'm not marching with the Israel haters.
Not every critique is an attack on you.
Oh, you can't see through their masks.
If there's a drought in Israel, the rain's anti-Semitic in Europe.
At least I pay attention.
Always using our suffering as a political football.
You're a useful fool.
Scapegoat.
Internationalist.
I wear that with pride, you Zionist bigot.
You didn't rat.
You heard a Nazi!
Not in front of the guys.
Did
Stop here. So I think that gives an example, a taste of it. The one in the white is Molly, well, is Leah, played by Molly, who's not Jewish, and Michal plays the other one. And so a lot of things come up. For example, the use of Yiddish and Jewish slang. I say that knowing that some people in this room are not Jewish and speak Yiddish much better than I could. And yet, could that be seen as appropriating? That's one problem. And I think another problem is, so it's, I don't know how it reads to everyone, but to me it reads as a very Jewish sort of bickering. And so there's a question of stereotyping as well here. And since these are not full characters, they don't go through a whole story, that we could think of it as quite a stereotyping kind of way of writing or way of performing. They just take on this role and do it. And to add even more complexity, they're not necessarily seen only positively. So it's not a romanticizing view of these Jewish women. And generally, most characters in this show don't always get, or not only shown in the best light. And Leah is somewhat of a bigot throughout the show. So what do you do with that? Not only playing a Jewish character, but playing a Jewish character who is a bigot when you're not Jewish. And I don't think we have a solution for that, but we had some, I want to share some things that we worked through with this, because as you saw, that decision was to go with that and to have Molly play these roles. And she's not the only one who plays Jewish roles. There's also recorded music of someone non-Jewish singing music from a Jewish point of view. And we had to do some, or we didn't have to do, we made some shifts, some changes in the text. Some lines were moved from one narrator to the other. We tried swapping them. We did all sorts of things. Some things changed, but generally we decided to stay with this idea that someone not Jewish can simply play this Jewish role. And I think we did it through two main important ideas. One of them was that the rehearsal space was always a safe space. And we said, we know that we're all here in good vibes, and it's all right to make mistakes, and it's all right to say if something doesn't feel comfortable. And that's a discussion that was held throughout the whole time. So if you want to experiment, you have to be willing to make mistakes in the rehearsal room. Now, it's very, very important. And I think the person who was most cautious, unsurprisingly maybe, but it was Molly, who was very, very, very attentive to these issues. And the second thing was that it's all done from a position of solidarity. So I think why as a non-Jewish person, you play a Jewish role, or what is the framing of that, is very, very important. So obviously, if someone who's not Jewish takes on a Jewish role to ridicule Jews, that's not great. But I would also say that if someone who's not Jewish takes on a Jewish role just because they believe they have the right to take on any role, because art is bigger than anything and shouldn't be limited by politics in any ways, I think that's also a problematic position. But if you're saying art is part of reality and it's a tool, and in this case, it's a tool for solidarity and for exploring these issues, then I think it changes the way you engage with these questions, both what sort of decisions you make and how you make them. And the bottom line is that I am very, very happy that we had Molly for this workshop and hopefully in the future. First of all, because she is a ridiculously talented actor and singer and someone who's great to work with, but also because actually having someone non-Jewish in the room was very, very useful. Everyone else in the room was Jewish, the musical director, myself, and the other actors. And having someone who's not Jewish was really valuable to see how different things read and how what's clear, what's not clear, how do people feel about it. And also it shaped the show. And the two narrators originally were written as two sort of Jewish narrators, and they changed to one Jewish and one non-Jewish narrator, and that really had a strong input on the show. I think it made it much better because, like, just for theatrical reasons, it's good to have tension, it's good to have difference. But not only that, I think it's a useful tool for non-Jews watching the show to have someone who's also non-Jewish on stage. I think I will leave it at this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uri. We will have a lot to discuss later on. And now, our last speaker, Dr. Sarah Sigal, who is originally from Chicago and based now in London, who is a freelance writer, dramaturg, director, and researcher working across new writing and devising site-specific theatre, film, and fiction. She has taught at numerous British universities and adapted her monograph, Writing in Collaborative Theatre Making, from her doctoral thesis at Goldsmith. She's a board member of the Dramaturgs Network Advisory Board and an associate fellow at the Birkbeck Center for Contemporary Theatre Research. She has recently directed her first short film, No Caller, and her first novel, Murder à la Mode, will be published in November. So now, oh no, in a year time. And she was the live performance programmer at JW3 between 2016 and 2019, and is currently writing a best practice document on working with Jewish artists and content for the Royal Court. Please, the floor is yours, and shall I try to share your presentation? Do you have sound?
No, it's a very, very basic part.
That's fine, that's great. Yeah.
Okay. I'm just gonna set a stopwatch so I don't go over time. I'm slightly worried now because I'm the last person to go, and of course my instinct was to make lots of notes because the previous talks were so interesting, and I kind of want to, my instinct is to sort of weave in some points from those talks, partly because I am also making some similar points and touching on similar topics. So just first, thank you to the organizers for having me. It's really lovely to be here. So I'm coming from a perspective of being a scholar, but also a theater practitioner. And I probably should have called this presentation Casting Jewishness, Theater in Practice, or something like that. But as I am a harried, overworked freelancer, I made this PowerPoint on the train as an afterthought after I had created this talk. So how I kind of root into all of this, I think, is sort of, I guess, significant on some level, is I was the live performance programmer at JW3, the Jewish Cultural Center in Northwest London, for 3 years, and became, I am a Jewish theater maker, was a Jewish theater maker already, but was interested in kind of roles of identity and roles of politics and how Jewish theater is made. What is Jewish theater? Who makes it? I was involved in what's called Falsetto Gate, what's now called Falsetto Gate. I'll get to that in a minute. And was also kind of involved in what was then called Herschel Fink Gate at the Royal Court, and more on that later. So I've sort of, I guess, become interested in talking about Jewish, I guess, representation and Jewish engagement, or engagement with Jewish topics on stage, kind of by accident in a way. So my talk is focusing on theater as opposed to TV or film. And I am talking about casting and kind of representation on stage, but this conversation also has implications for other roles throughout the creative and production teams on shows. And I'll talk about that a little bit as well. My disclaimer is, I don't have any answers. Everything kind of depends on the situation. I think anyone who claims to have like hard and fast answers is a charlatan. I think there are kind of ideas of best practice and what we think is probably not good practice, but I think it's about the particular situation. It's about the project, who's making it, what the subject matter is, why it's getting made, what's happening, are there Jews involved, why are they involved, why are they not involved, etc. And another kind of disclaimer is I'm kind of echoing an article about queer theater and appropriating some ideas from that, which is, in order to make truly representative, ethical theater, you have to be working outside a kind of hierarchical, capitalistic, patriarchal structure, and we're not doing that. So we're kind of, these are ideas that come out of, we're trying to do the best we can in the structures within which we work. And it's always important to keep in mind that whether it's film or TV or theater, there are a small number of gatekeepers at the top, which has an impact on all of this. I'm thinking of this talk as kind of a starting point for discussion rather than answers again. And because I am a dramaturg and dramaturgs ask questions, and I'm a Jew and Jews ask questions, I thought it was appropriate that this be about asking questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of present a few issues in the form of questions and discuss that a bit. And then I'll talk about three kind of recent case studies and in how Jewish representation has been handled, and then kind of close with some, I guess, some ideas and suggestions. So it's my very rudimentary PowerPoint. Question number one, what does a Jew look like? I mean, I think all of this is stemming really from the truly troubling, problematic, eternal question of what does a Jew look like? Which is, you know, the close cousin of like, but you don't look Jewish. Or, oh, you're too Jewish to play X, or you're not Jewish enough to play X. So there's this idea of like, you know, who are we casting? What is the idea of what a Jew looks like in our minds? How does the character embody that? What is the director thinking? What is the writer thinking? And what are the producers thinking? Do they have an idea of what a Jew looks like in their head? It would seem that in many cases, yes, they do, unfortunately. And there is this idea of, if we have an idea of what a Jew looks like, it is limiting to Jewish performers. Does a Jew look like a Jew? Does a Jew not look like a Jew? And who's making those decisions? And it kind of, it's important to think about like the sort of diaspora. And in a lot of these case studies, we've kind of discussed today, there's this sort of issue of, are we considering the diaspora when we're talking about casting Jews? Or are we coming from a kind of white Ashken normative perspective? So there's this like first question of what does a Jew look like, and how does this kind of potentially play into casting? Who gets to play Jews, and who do Jews get to play? Sort of anecdotally, a friend, when I was involved in the kind of falsettos, this issue of this musical falsettos, it's very Jewish, that had no Jews involved in the cast or creative team. I was posting about it on social media, and the husband of one of my friends, who's an actor, got very angry at me and sort of fought back and said, you know, sort of like, well, you're limiting the options of actors, and this is ridiculous. And are you saying that only Jews can play Jewish characters? So it's this kind of, as we've seen in the previous two talks, a kind of essentializing these arguments. And I thought that was kind of interesting coming from a man who is a cis white British male, privately educated with a natural RP. And I kind of think, well, like a lot of characters are actually your natural casting. So why are you upset? But that's a whole other issue. And, you know, who gets to play Jews? Who do Jews get to play? I was recently watching, and this is jumping into film for a minute. I was on a plane and I was watching Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris. Don't judge me. And Jason Isaacs, who's a pretty well-known Jewish actor, and I think pretty well-known as a Jewish actor, was playing a kind of Northern Irish 1950s bookie. And whether the character was Jewish or not wasn't specified, and it didn't seem relevant. And I would hate to think that, you know, unless that bookie was Jewish, he can't play it, because he was, you know, he was quite good. Reflecting on this kind of quote from Elliot Levy that was in Sue's talk of like the dystopian nightmare of being asked to present your Jewish papers in order to play a Jewish role, is kind of interesting coming from him, because he has played lots of Jewish roles, and recently played Herr Schultz in Cabaret, and I believe won an Olivier for that. So I'm kind of wondering how people stand with it with relation to this, if they weren't readily identifiable or publicly known as Jews. You know, Elliot Levy has a fairly Jewish name, and he's often cast as Jews, and he doesn't have, I mean, no one's asking him to present his papers, but it's sort of a question when people take a kind of stand, kind of comes down to personal experience and personal identity, and how you may have benefited or not from that. So again, I'm not sort of coming up with solutions, I'm sort of asking some questions. And the next role, which Sue talked about a little bit, is what role does gender play in all of this? Is it, again, these are kind of questions for consideration. Yeah, this harking back to this idea of Sarah Silverman's question of when do Jewish women get to play Jewish women? Is it when they're like, you know, sort of beautiful and heroic, or is it when they're sort of there for comedic effect, or they're a stock character, or a sort of a best friend, or an older woman? You know, when who is actually being cast as a Jew? When is it Jewish women being cast as women? When is it Jewish men being cast as men? And is there a double standard? You could almost say that there is maybe a kind of parallel between female characters of color often being played by light-skinned or white women. I'm not saying it's the same, but I think there might be some, you know, issues at play of what is normative or what is considered beautiful, that are, you know, interesting issues, interesting and problematic issues. As Sue was saying, this issue of Agnes O'Casey playing Vivian, then there's a kind of harking back to her kind of historical Jewish identity, but then she has a name, a stage name where she presents as Irish. And what does that all mean? It's a kind of, it's very tangled, but interesting. And I think there are questions worth asking. My next question is, how can we look at this intersectionally? What role does intersectionality play? And both speakers have spoken about this a little bit already. You know, JewFace is not the same as blackface, nor should it be compared in that way. There are differences between blackface and its history, and Jews, non-Jews playing Jews, to do with whiteness. It's not the same as, quotes, you know, if a non-disabled actor plays a disabled role, these things are not the same, in a way that anti-Semitism doesn't manifest in the same way as sort of, for instance, anti-Black racism. But it's how can we engage with issues of casting in a way that's intersectional and sensitive to other identities and other issues within the theater industry, really. Or as Uri was saying, how do we behave kind of with solidarity? And so that's a kind of question to ask. And then there's a kind of issue of, you know, we come back to this issue of what does a Jew look like when the Jew in question isn't white. If you kind of assume, if you have this idea in your mind, if you're a casting director, if you're a director, you're not Jewish, even if you are and you're casting an idea of someone's idea of what a Jew is, it's often erasing Jews of color. So that's a whole other situation that's important to kind of consider. And then lastly, the essential question is who, what, where, and why. Why is the piece being produced and commissioned? Who is involved? Who's doing it? Why are they doing it? Is there meaningful Jewish presence or representation in the creative team, in the production team, in the cast? And, you know, what's the kind of framing around it? Is it within a Jewish building for a Jewish festival? Are there no Jews involved in the kind of commissioning of it, but the writer is Jewish? There are lots of things to be considered. I told someone I was giving this talk earlier today, and they said you should kind of like set up some kind of diagram or spreadsheet with questions, and then you can see how things kind of intersect, because it's quite complicated. So my first case study, I keep referring to this production of Falsettos, which is an American, very Jewish American musical that was written by William Finn and James Lapine, and it was revived. This is the first London production of it in 2019 at the Other Palace Theatre, and notably no Jews were involved in a very Jewish show that's about a bar mitzvah. And the kind of question there is, what are the ethics of this, or the lack thereof? And my kind of interest in this show is that in 2019, I had just finished this job at JW3 working with lots of Jewish makers and with Jewish content, with non-Jewish makers and Jewish shows that involve Jews and non-Jews. And myself and some other friends and collaborators worked on an open letter that was then kind of disseminated and published in various outlets such as The Stage. And we were concerned for a number of reasons. We were concerned that this was such an inherently Jewish show with no Jews involved. How accurate is it going to be? Will it result in kind of Jewish stereotyping? And I'll read you just a little bit of the letter. So we wrote, in 2019 in London, it seems impossible that a production of a show as obviously concerned with Jewish religion and culture as Falsettos could announce a cast with no Jewish representation whatsoever. Even more troubling is the way the theater industry as a whole has failed to notice this glaring omission, or perhaps has failed to care. In a time of increasing anti-Semitism, of verbal and physical attacks on Jewish people, and wholesale violent shootings in synagogues, Jewish schools, and cultural centers forced to be protected by security guards, it feels more crucial now than ever to make accurate representation and cultural sensitivity around Judaism a priority in theater. So it's not just, you know, people who aren't Jewish putting on a show with Jewish characters. We felt it went deeper than that. It was people doing this. And then when we flagged it, Celador, the production company, tried to ignore it, and then they fought back, and there was a lot of rancor, and there was never an apology. And then they brought on a sort of Jewish sensitivity reader, dramaturg, consultant, which to us felt like a band-aid. So this is what I'm speaking to in terms of this idea of context, like how are these situations treated, because they could have responded very differently, and they didn't. And also the kind of greater context of the British theater industry. What was almost even more troubling to many of us who were kind of involved in this campaign was the silence from the rest of the theater industry, knowing hardly anyone said anything. We had so few allies, and it was sort of disturbing, and it was quite depressing. I remember being at a birthday party of a friend who works in the industry, and another friend came up to me. I was someone who runs a building, and she said, you know, it's a real shame about this. It's, you know, I feel really bad about this situation. It's really awful. And I remember thinking at the time, why don't you say something? You're quite well known and you have a platform. So there's something in the kind of context of these situations that feels significant. The case study number 2 is the upcoming revival of Lorraine Hansberry's play, her 1964 play, The Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window, which is going to go up in, I think, February of 2023 at the Brooklyn Academy of Music in New York. And a friend, I was talking about how I was writing this talk, and a friend of mine who's based in New York, who's a playwright, not Jewish, which is interesting. She said, well, have you heard about this? And I said, no. So it's directed by Anne Kaufman, who, as far as I know, is a Jewish director. But, and this is sort of, maybe this is like blocking your view a little bit, but you can kind of see on the right, the 2 leads. This is sort of an example of, you know, star-studded casting. We have Rachel Brosnahan on the right and Oscar Isaacs on the left. And as I kind of considered the casting of 2 actors who are not Jewish, it kind of led me down a rabbit hole, because I didn't know much about the play. I just knew that it was the lesser known work of Lorraine Hansberry, who was not Jewish, but prominent African-American playwright, who famously wrote and was, because of this play, the first Black woman to be produced on Broadway, A Raisin in the Sun. And what I think is interesting, again, talking about not just what we see on stage and not just who we see being cast, but the overall context. Does it make a difference that this play was written because Lorraine Hansberry was a woman who was not Jewish, married to a Jewish man? The play was kind of loosely based on their marriage and all its complexities. And it was about 2 people living in New York, and the idea of like counterculture and bohemians and political activism in New York in the 1960s. And I kind of think to myself, if you're casting someone who's not Jewish in the role, what does that really mean for the legacy of this play, for people who were involved in originally writing it and creating it, and their kind of fight for civil liberties? I'm not saying Oscar Isaacs won't do a good job. I just kind of wonder what that means. And then there's the kind of question, the very complex question of Rachel Brosnahan, who many people know as being famous for playing the marvelous Mrs. Maisel on TV. And you see that face, and I went, okay, so obviously Oscar Isaac is playing Sidney Brustein. That's a Jewish character. And then I looked at all the descriptions of the play, because I've never seen it or read it, and I thought, well, is his wife meant to be Jewish? Because to me, casting Rachel Brosnahan, even though she's not Jewish, she has now become, I think, coded as Jewish. I'm like, is the wife Jewish? So we have 2 non-Jews playing 2 Jews or not? And then I did some research, and we can see in the photo on the left of the original production in New York, it was Rita Moreno who originally played his wife, who people will know as the original Anita in West Side Story. So I'm like, okay, so the original cast didn't have Jews, so maybe that character isn't Jewish. And then Rita Moreno playing a Latinx character? Would they have done that in 1964? And so why does that mean the character is Latinx? Would they have engaged in that kind of representation? So then if she is, why the hell is Rachel Brosnahan playing that role, who is white and not Jewish? So it led me down a hole. I'm taking you with me on the confused journey that I had. And it just kind of asks a lot of questions about, like, what happens when you get the same non-Jewish people to play Jews, or maybe you're like framing them as Jewish, like Rachel Brosnahan. And what happens if you're casting someone who is not Jewish to play an explicitly Jewish character, like Oscar Isaac, to play that role? And if it's a political play, what does this mean? So no solutions, just questions. I'm already over time. I apologize. I will keep it to a couple more minutes. And the third case study, which we've already discussed a little bit, is Jews in Their Own Words, the recent Royal Court play that just closed a few days ago. I have lots of my own opinions about the efficacy or lack thereof of that play, but it is an interesting case study, as Sue was saying, because it is an entirely Jewish cast. Everyone you see in that kind of promo shot of the cast on the kind of upper left is a Jewish identifying performer. And I think there are a lot of I'll say interesting issues with Jews in Their Own Words, but I will say it was maybe one of the few times I've seen a kind of very intentionally Jewish, intentionally diverse group of performers on stage. You kind of see a little bit of an idea of the Jewish diaspora to some degree. And actually that isn't the entire cast. I think there's an actor missing from that shot, but it's sort of interesting to think about what does happen when you put Jews on stage and why you put Jews playing Jews on stage. And the thing that we haven't talked about much is what kind of impact does this have on the people playing those Jews, on the Jews playing those Jews, on the non-Jews playing those Jews. And knowing some people in the cast, they talked to me about how it was an overwhelmingly positive experience for them because they got to have discussions. They felt comfortable having discussions amongst each other that they might not otherwise, which I thought was interesting. And I do think that the experience of the creative team and the cast does have an impact on the final product. And I do think the Royal Court was being, I think, wisely in some ways intentional about casting Jews as Jews. And for those of you who don't know, this show could be argued that it was a response to what is known as the Herschel Fink situation, when the play Rare Earth Metal that was on at the Royal Court about a year ago framed unknowingly, they say unknowingly frames a non-Jewish character, gave that character a Jewish name, Herschel Fink, and then framed them as a greedy billionaire, which we know why that's problematic. So this show is kind of an apology for that in a way. So I'm over time, but my concluding thoughts on kind of best practice is the first thought is meaningful representation is important. It's not just about, are you casting Jews as Jews? Are you putting Jews on stage? It's like, who's making the decisions? Do you have Jewish script readers if it's being made in a building? Do you have Jewish producers? Are there Jewish directors? Are there Jewish designers? Like, what's the representation? Is there any? Is it meaningful? I was speaking to a woman who is, she's American, she's Latinx and Jewish, and she was talking about a trend in the US of dramaturgs being hired as kind of sensitivity readers for shows where they know there isn't enough representation from that community when they're making a play about a particular community. And then they bring in a dramaturg who's Jewish or Latinx or whatever to do a kind of sensitivity read. I would argue that's not meaningful representation. Number two, it's not enough to do no harm. It's important to contribute positively to representation. So it's important to, for instance, remember that Jews can look like lots of different things. We can be lots of different people. Jews are white and mixed race and Asian and disabled and queer and lots of other things. And if we are casting non-Jews as Jews, what's the idea that we have in our minds that we are reproducing, either consciously or unconsciously? And the last point is, whether you're Jewish or not, be willing to engage meaningfully with the work. And again, I'll call back to Uri's paper, which is talking about acting in solidarity. And it's important to do that. Do the research and have the conversations and create a safe space to have discussions, so you can have Jews and non-Jews engaging in Jewish work in ways that are meaningful and feel safe and interesting, because theater is about collaboration. I am over time, but thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. you so much, Sarah, Sue, and Uri. We have very little time left for questions, but let's say 15 minutes. Okay, so are there any questions in the Zoom audience or in the in-person audience, please? Are there any questions in the chat?
Sue has a question.
Oh, Sue, wait, so microphone.
Hold it close.
Yes,
Is that
perfect.
it? Thanks everybody for your amazing talks. And it was, my question is whether this is a British thing. I know that Sarah, particularly you mentioned an American play, but I wondered if some of the features of class and accent and a small Jewish community and people saying they didn't really realize whether or not that's true, are these the coming together of Britishness and Jewishness or not, is my question.
First, I mean, I don't have an answer, but I have some thoughts on that. I was thinking about that a lot too. And I think definitely these issues change from context to context. So in Israel, it would be a different discussion because most of the actors you see on stage are Jewish. And I think that every context has its own things. Like in the US, you have many, many more Jews on television than you do in British television. And I think that does make a difference. So if you have a show that has 3/4 of the people are Jewish, and then you have one person who's not Jewish playing a Jewish character, personally, if they're doing it well and respectfully, I really don't mind it. And I think there are other places in the world, and it makes me think as a writer about how these discourses can also be limiting for Jewish writers. Because I think about someone like Hanoch Levin, Israeli playwright, whose work is performed all over the world in places where hardly there is any Jewish community. And obviously his characters are very Jewish. Would you say his play can't be put on in Japan at all because there are not enough Jewish Japanese actors? I think that would be a shame. So I think context definitely does play into it in some ways. And about accents, we spent so much time talking about accents. It's amazing. Like in the UK, when you do theater, that's so much of what you do. Yeah, thanks.
That's such a long, that's another conversation. It's like a potentially really long conversation. And it's like, as Uri was saying, it's like really country specific. And I guess I can really only like knowingly to some degree speak to the British American comparison. What's strange is I haven't lived in the US for 17 years. And I can only kind of speak in a limited degree to what's happening in America. But when I was actually talking about this issue with the dramaturg that I mentioned, who's based in the US, Linde Rosario, we were having this conversation about representation, and I was talking about Jewish representation. I was saying how in the UK, it feels like maybe because there are just fewer Jews and there's less Jewish representation and there are fewer Jews involved than there are in the US, there seem to be more problems. And she said, oh, that's not true. And that kind of made me quite sad that she said, we are also having that problem in the US, which is to me kind of startling considering how many Jews are working in theater and TV and film. And what I find sometimes is the difference is it's non-Jews making ill-informed or ignorant decisions in the UK, and in the US, sometimes it's Jews making those decisions. Like for instance, this director, Anne, I'm just, kind of curious about Anne Kaufman, who I assume, maybe I'm making an unfair assumption, but I assume based on her name, she is a Jewish director, and then she doesn't cast a Jew in the main role of a play in New York City, where there are so many Jews. It's sort of, there are other questions. They're not totally dissimilar, but I'm going to ramble if I keep going, so I'll stop.
Thank you very much. We have actually questions in Zoom, and Philip Glassborough, who has read text for us and who is who is also a playwright, would like to speak, I think, and has shared his experience of the difficulty to find actually Jewish actors. Do you want to come in, Philip?
Oh, thank you. The question about a community of actors is so interesting. The musical I've written is called A Kid for Two Farthings, and it's based on a story from the 1950s by Wolf Mankiewicz, which was filmed in the 50s. And back in the 50s in England, there was a whole cadre of wonderful Jewish character actors, David Kossoff, Alfie Bass, Sidney Tatler, the list goes on, and they were all in the film. But we were trying to find their equivalents today for the musical, and there isn't. It hadn't been done then, this play that Sarah mentioned, The Jews in Their Own Words, and we could not track them down. Agents were very reticent to say. We said, we were trying to find Jewish actors. They didn't want to identify their clients as Jewish. And we even tried to track down the signatories to the letter you mentioned, Sarah, which seemed to be a sort of group of people. And the stage wouldn't put us in touch with them. So we were banging our heads together because we're pretty
Googleable, the signatories of that letter. You can find a lot of us online pretty easily.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, our casting director, I know, tried a few people who didn't respond. But anyway, I mean, this is not a criticism. It's just saying that it was hard to find, and we wanted to find Jewish actors to play these roles, and it was hard to track them down. And then you do have the other phenomenon of an actor like Henry Goodman, who doesn't necessarily want to play Jewish characters or to become typecast in that field, because they want to be playing more general roles. So that's just another question for your list of questions.
Thank you, Philip, for your contribution. Benji, do you want to come in?
Yes, thank you. I'm here from Vienna, and I'm a musician and ethnomusicological researcher, and the context here is quite different. I just want to mention the Tom Stoppard's Leopoldstadt, which was premiered in Vienna about 5 months ago. And it was interesting. I went to the premiere, and it was immediately, there were some unbelievable mistakes that I just instantaneously knew there was not a Jew involved in the entire production. No actors of this huge ensemble piece. And it was very interesting. The context in the German-speaking world is, of course, quite different, and the representation of Jews in public space takes on additional layers of meaning. And my synopsis of this experience is that the theater, which was a beloved Nazi, which was a beloved theater of Hitler's, actually, the Josefstadt theater. This theater, it felt almost like just signal verge. Like they were like, okay, we have to do this. Of course, we're in Vienna. Somebody has to do it. We're going to do it. We're going for it. We're really going to do it here in Vienna. We're bringing this really important piece of theater to Vienna. And then there was just no in-depth research done. It was kind of astonishing and deeply insulting. And the critical reaction, there was none. Like the press within the Jewish community, people were upset about a few things, but didn't really take it to the next level of understanding to the degree of what this representation or misrepresentation means or could mean. And within the general cultural criticism, there's just nothing. People were just like, it's great, it's on stage here, punkt. And that was it. So just to complicate the discussion, of course, in each country it's quite different, and particularly in the German-speaking world, the layers added on are quite problematic. So if you have any commentary on that, I would be very interested, or just to share that experience.
Just before you reply, thank you very much, Benji. We also have a comment in Zoom, and we have a very transnational audience. So saying that the question of context in other countries is important, that in the Netherlands, this is not a discussion at all, and that the Jewish representation is actually not a question, or that there are very few Jewish actors playing Jewish characters, but that it doesn't really raise debate. So I don't know if you want to respond.
I could respond to the to your interested to see a production of Schnitzler's play Dr. I'm trying to remember the name, but it was a play about a Jewish doctor from the turn of the century who performs an abortion, and it had been adapted, but a very radical adaptation, and they had made it contemporary, but the Jewish doctor was gone, the anti-Semitism was gone. It was a play about anti-Semitism, and instead it was a play about Islamophobia and a Turkish German Muslim politician. And my question there was a talkback session with the dramaturg, and I raised my hand and I said, you know, why did you guys decide to make this choice rather than commissioning a play from scratch about Islamophobia and a Turkish German politician? And there was a kind of, I thought, bit of a bullshit reply. And I said, it feels like it's an erasure of anti-Semitism in Germany and in German theater. And I could hear everyone go, and it wasn't a popular thing. And then a few people came up to me and said that they felt terribly guilty. So yeah, it's really different in different countries. It's interesting being, I was only there for like a weekend. As a British American, it was a strange experience.
Thank you. So, Uri?
Just to say that I didn't expect you to say that, Benji, about Vienna. I thought that they would be much more caretaken in the German-speaking world, and your example as well, Sarah. That's quite dismaying. So that's my only comment.
I could just add another complication and think about Israel as well, and shows like Shtisel, where everyone is Jewish, but not Haredi, and playing Haredi roles, and yeah. Definitely questions all around.
Okay, maybe a last question in the audience, Anushka.
Again, less of a question and more kind of continue on this. Another complication is that Tom Stoppard is Jewish. He found out in the 90s that all his grandparents were Jewish and killed in the Holocaust. And so he wrote Leopoldstadt as a response to that. I also saw it and didn't like it. And I found it very reductive and essentialist. But I guess, are we to police how Jewish someone is, or how authentic or how accurate they are in their own understanding of Jewishness? Of course, there should have been historical accuracy, but I think it's complicated for us if we start saying that someone isn't Jewish enough or isn't good enough at being a Jew, and therefore they have to be kind of policed in what they're producing in terms of their art, especially when it's based on their own family experiences.
Thank you. Do you want to reply?
Just to respond, that my own feeling about this, and this could be a provocation right before the end, but is I think we need to ask whether a piece is offensive or not. And then if it is, it doesn't matter if there are Jews involved or if they're not. And that should be and having no Jews can be something, it could make a show into offensive. I don't think it has to, but it could create these unclarities, these mistakes, and these feelings of uncomfortableness. But I think we shouldn't ask, are there Jews or not? Because that's an essentialist question. We should ask, is this offensive? And are there Jews or not, is something at the back of our minds or part of our discussion when we ask, is this offensive towards Jews or not? That's my own opinion.
Just to add, and also, is it good?
I think, is it good? Both is it offensive and is it good are both very subjective questions. Like, offensive to who, good to who? You know, I've had lots of arguments about Leopoldstadt with lots of people about whether it's good or not. I didn't like it, but I know lots of people who did, and I think, you know, that's the whole point of art, I suppose. But I do think there are conditions under which the potential, the limited nature of representation and the limited nature of the discussions that might be had in the writer's room or the rehearsal room can then lead to bad art, and bad art, which is sometimes reductive or simplistic, can then be offensive. So I think all these things are kind of linked. It's like, what's the quality of the conversations that you're having in the room, irrespective of who's in the room? Have you done your research? Are you having nuanced discussions? Are you making assumptions? Are you reproducing stereotypes? And then, you know, that will lead to sort of better or worse performance, I think. So these things are kind of like taste and ethics, I suppose, are linked in that way.
Thank you very much, everybody. So we could have continued the discussion, but I'm afraid we have to stop. I came a long way, I must say. I remember having this discussion with Uri when you started casting your show, and I think it has really brought, well, for me, a lot of, you know, more complexity to how I looked at this topic or discussion before. So thank you very much. So a last round of applause to Sarah, Sue, and Uri.